The shock didn't come quietly. It arrived as an ultimatum, blunt, public, and deliberately destabilizing. The Donald Trump administration unveiled what it called the Forge Initiative, a hardline demand that Canada permanently lock its energy, minerals, and strategic resources into the U.S. supply chain. Oil, natural gas, uranium, critical minerals, everything that keeps modern industry alive would flow south exclusively on Washington's terms. The threat was explicit. Refuse, and the United States would unleash massive tariffs across Canadian exports, from energy to manufacturing to agriculture. The message was simple: comply or be economically crushed. This wasn't negotiation, it was economic siege warfare dressed up as security cooperation. Inside Washington, the assumption was absolute compliance. Canada, long treated as a junior partner within the North American system, was expected to blink. The integrated energy framework between the two countries, an $865 billion web of pipelines, grids, contracts, and logistics, was seen as leverage. Pull hard enough and Ottawa would fall back into line. But the ultimatum revealed something deeper about the moment the world has entered. The United States was no longer asking, it was commanding. The Forge Initiative reframed energy not as shared prosperity, but as control. Access would be conditional. Independence would be punished. In effect, Washington was saying that proximity equals subordination. For American audiences, the stakes were largely invisible at first. Energy agreements sound abstract. Supply chains feel distant. But this framework quietly underpinned affordable fuel, stable electricity prices, and industrial reliability across the Midwest and Northeast. It kept factories running and homes heated without drama. That stability was now being weaponized. The gamble was rooted in past precedent. For decades, pressure worked. Smaller partners absorbed the shock to preserve access to the U.S. market. But this time, the global context had changed. Energy had become a strategic weapon. Trade had become a battlefield, and coercion, once normalized, was now openly challenged. The ultimatum was meant to end the story before it began. Instead, it lit the fuse. Ottawa's response stunned Washington and the markets. Instead of counteroffers or quiet diplomacy, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney detonated the assumption that Canada would submit. In a single move, his government walked away from the table and collapsed the entire integrated energy framework that had bound the two countries together for decades. This wasn't a partial freeze. It wasn't a delay. It was a clean break. The $865 billion system, pipelines, grid coordination, cross-border energy guarantees, was treated not as sacred infrastructure, but as leverage that had been misused. Negotiators were pulled out. Working groups were dissolved. Contracts were flagged for review. The message was unmistakable. Canada would not negotiate under threat, and it would not lock its economic future into a relationship defined by coercion. For Washington, this was unthinkable. The Forge Initiative had been built on the belief that interdependence favored the United States, that Canada needed access more than America needed supply.
Carney flipped that logic on its head. Interdependence, he argued, only works when both sides retain dignity and choice. Strip that away, and the system collapses. What made the move even more jarring was its speed. There was no prolonged debate, no drawn-out parliamentary theater. The decision came fast, signaling preparation. Ottawa had already mapped the risks. It had already calculated the pain, and it had already concluded that submission would be worse than disruption. In Canada, the move was framed not as defiance, but as survival. Energy sovereignty became the language of the moment. So did economic self-respect. The collapse of the framework was presented as a necessary rupture, short-term instability, to avoid long-term dependency. For American industry, the reality set in almost immediately. Supply certainty vanished overnight. The assumption that Canadian energy would always be there, cheap, reliable, politically guaranteed, was suddenly false. And with no replacement ready, the costs were no longer theoretical. This was the moment the power dynamic shifted. Canada wasn't reacting anymore. It was acting. And by choosing to walk away rather than bend, Ottawa signaled something far more dangerous to Washington than tariffs ever could. It signaled independence. Then the legal ground shifted beneath Washington's feet. In a ruling that blindsided the White House, the Supreme Court of the United States struck down the administration's attempt to use emergency powers to impose sweeping tariffs without congressional approval.
The decision didn't just limit authority, it exposed fragility. The Forge Initiative had been built on threat. Tariffs were the hammer, but now the hammer was legally cracked. For months, the administration projected strength, impose penalties, escalate pressure, force compliance. That strategy depended on one core assumption, that emergency economic powers were unquestionable and immediate. The court's ruling shattered that premise. Any new tariff regime would face procedural hurdles, political battles in Congress, and potential delays measured in months. Canada was watching closely, and Ottawa understood something critical. The ultimatum no longer had teeth. Without enforceable tariff authority, Washington's leverage became rhetorical. Strong words, press conferences, and market intimidation, yes. Immediate economic punishment, no. The difference is everything. In power politics, credibility is currency. Once doubt enters the equation, markets react, allies hedge, and adversaries test boundaries. Carney's government recognized the opening instantly. The legal constraint transformed risk calculations. Rejecting the ultimatum no longer meant certain, immediate economic devastation. It meant uncertainty, and uncertainty cuts both ways. Meanwhile, inside the United States, institutional division became visible. The executive branch wanted escalation. The judiciary demanded limits. Congress was split. That fragmentation projected weakness at the worst possible moment. In international negotiations, coherence is strength. Division invites defiance. The irony was brutal. An initiative designed to consolidate American control instead revealed structural limits.
Canada didn't need to outmuscle the United States. It only needed to withstand the bluff long enough for the internal constraints to surface. And once they did, the balance tilted. This was no longer a contest of who could threaten harder. It became a test of who could endure uncertainty longer. Canada signaled it was prepared for disruption. The United States, suddenly constrained by its own institutions, looked less like an unstoppable force and more like a divided power struggling to enforce its will. That realization changed everything. With Washington's leverage exposed, Ottawa moved from defense to redesign. This was no longer about resisting pressure. It was about rewriting the system itself. The government launched an aggressive buy-Canadian economic pivot aimed at hardening domestic supply chains and reducing dependence on U.S.-controlled inputs. Energy infrastructure projects were fast-tracked using Canadian firms only. U.S. contractors were quietly blocked from bidding on public energy, grid, and transportation upgrades. Procurement rules were rewritten to favor domestic production, even at higher short-term cost. The logic was blunt. Vulnerability is created by convenience. Canada chose redundancy over efficiency. At the same time, Ottawa began redirecting trade outward, not south. Long-standing discussions with Europe were revived, but the real shot came from the Pacific. In a move that blindsided Washington, Canada finalized a surprise trade agreement with China covering electric vehicles, battery components, and agricultural exports. The deal bypassed the United States entirely. Canadian critical minerals would feed Asian EV supply chains. Canadian agriculture would gain preferential access to Chinese markets at a moment when U.S. exporters were facing growing barriers. For Canada, this wasn't ideological alignment, it was diversification. Fewer choke points, fewer political risks, more optionality. The signal was unmistakable. Canada was no longer organizing its economy around American approval. It was building parallel routes. This shift unsettled more than trade analysts. It rattled the core assumption of North American economics that Canada's default orientation was permanently southward. By proving that alternatives could be activated quickly, Ottawa reframed itself from dependent partner to autonomous middle power. There were costs. Domestic prices rose, transition friction hit manufacturers, but the government framed this pain as strategic investment, pay now to avoid submission later. And politically, the move resonated. Economic sovereignty became a rallying point, not a sacrifice. For the United States, the implications were severe. Blocking Canadian exports no longer meant isolation, it meant redirection. Every pressure tactic now risked accelerating Canada's exit from the US-centric system. The transformation wasn't loud.
There were no victory speeches, but the architecture of dependence was quietly being dismantled. And once supply chains reroute, they rarely come back. The reaction was immediate and unforgiving. Energy futures spiked within hours. Natural gas contracts jumped.
Electricity price forecasts across the northern United States were revised upward. Traders weren't reacting to ideology. They were pricing in scarcity. When certainty disappears from energy markets, volatility rushes in. U.S. manufacturers felt it next. Plants dependent on steady Canadian inputs, fuel, power, processed materials, began contingency planning. Some slowed production, others warned of layoffs. Investor calls filled with the same question: how exposed are we if this freeze drags on? The answer was uncomfortable. Across the Atlantic, the mood shifted from concern to calculation. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Prime Minister World Economic Forum took the stage and delivered a message that landed far beyond the conference hall. Middle powers, he argued, to no longer afford quiet compliance with coercive superpowers. Economic pressure, once normalized, now demanded collective resistance. It was a warning and an invitation. For European and Asian governments, the speech reframed Canada's rupture with the United States not as recklessness, but as a case study. If a G7 economy could absorb the shock and survive, then diversification was not just possible, it was prudent. Capital followed that logic. Investment began shifting towards jurisdictions perceived as less vulnerable to unilateral U.S. pressure. Markets noticed the pattern before policymakers did. The U.S. dollar remained dominant, but confidence showed hairline fractures. Analysts began openly discussing a world where access to American markets came with increasing political risk. Not collapse, realignment. Slow, strategic, and hard to reverse.
Meanwhile, allies who had once relied on Washington's stability started hedging. Long-term contracts were rewritten. Backup suppliers were secured. Redundancy replaced trust. The irony was stark. An effort to tighten control over North American energy had instead accelerated a global conversation about escape routes from U.S. dominance. Canada hadn't just rejected an ultimatum, it had forced a reckoning, and the world was adjusting accordingly. In Washington, the instinct was escalation. That had always worked before. Donald Trump doubled down. Public warnings, televised threats, and promises of total economic response. The strategy was familiar. Overwhelm, intimidate, force the other side to crack under pressure. But this time the tactics landed differently. Instead of submission, supply chains seized. As uncertainty deepened, U.S. distributors overstocked. Prices rose. Energy costs filtered through the economy, hitting transportation, food, and manufacturing. For American consumers, the fallout showed up in higher utility bills and more expensive goods, costs that couldn't be blamed on foreign adversaries without also implicating Washington's own strategy. Canada, meanwhile, hardened its position. Emergency reserves were expanded. Strategic stockpiles were built. New export controls were drafted, not announced, just prepared. The country wasn't panicking, it was insulating. Trump's reliance on public pressure backfired most visibly in the markets. Investors hate unpredictability, and escalation without enforceable tools is the worst kind. Each new threat increased volatility without delivering results. The U.S. began to look like the reactive party. The power reversal was subtle, but real. Historically, the United States imposed pain and waited. Now it was absorbing it. Every tariff threat delayed by courts, every retaliatory measure blocked by legal or political friction, weakened credibility further. Canada didn't need to win outright, it only needed to hold its line. The deeper damage was systemic. Businesses learned a lesson we wouldn't forget. Political brinkmanship had become a supply chain risk. And once companies factor that into long-term planning, they design around it. By trying to force obedience, Washington accelerated its own vulnerability. The tactics hadn't changed. The world had. And in that mismatch, leverage quietly slipped away. What comes next is no longer about who blinked first. It's about who can endure the consequences longest and who can redefine the outcome. 3 paths are now visible. The first is a prolonged freeze. Canada stalls. Negotiations remain open, but nothing moves. energy flows continue only at minimum contractual levels. The United States absorbs the slow bleed, higher prices, nervous markets, and mounting pressure from industry, while political leaders insist the strategy is working. This is the quiet damage scenario. No explosion, just attrition. The second is catastrophic escalation. Border measures tighten, energy exports are restricted, regulatory friction becomes weaponized. Power grids, fuel supplies, and manufacturing chains feel the strains simultaneously. This is the high-risk path, one miscalculation away from recessionary shock on both sides of the border.
It's the option no one wants, but brinkmanship makes possible. The third is retreat, carefully disguised as victory. In this scenario, Washington de-escalates, language softens. The Forge initiative is quietly rebranded or shelved. Talks resume under mutual respect, and concessions are reframed as strategic realignment. For domestic audiences, the narrative is control restored. For markets, it's relief. For history, that's a signal that coercion failed. No matter which path unfolds, the outcome is already locked in. The old rules are gone. North American trade was once built on predictability and mutual dependence. That system has been cracked open. Canada has demonstrated that walking away is possible and survivable. Other middle powers have taken notes. Once that lesson spreads, leverage erodes everywhere. For the United States, the cost is not just economic, it's reputational. Leadership depends on trust as much as force. When allies begin designing systems that minimize exposure to Washington, influence declines, even if power remains. For Donald Trump, the gamble was dominance through pressure. The result has been the opposite: resistance, diversification, and fragmentation. This moment won't end with a single agreement or press conference. It marks a transition from a US-centered economic order to a more contested, defensive, and multipolar one. The shockwave started at the border. It doesn't stop there. Key takeaways from the analysis. 1. The US, under Donald Trump, issued a hard ultimatum demanding Canada lock its energy and critical resources exclusively into the American supply chain under the Forge initiative.
The assumption, Canada would comply under pressure. 2. Canada, led by Mark Carney, refused and went further. Ottawa collapsed the $865 billion integrated energy framework instead of negotiating under threat. 3. A ruling by the Supreme Court of the United States weakened the administration's emergency tariff authority, exposing limits to Washington's enforcement power and undermining the credibility of its threats. 4. Canada pivoted strategically. Buy Canadian policies, blocking U.S. contractors, redirecting trade toward Europe and Asia, and signing new agreements, including a surprise trade deal with China. 5. Markets reacted fast. Energy futures spiked. U.S. manufacturers faced uncertainty. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Carney openly called on middle powers to resist coercion, signaling global realignment. 6. Escalation tactics backfired. Instead of forcing compliance, they increased prices, destabilized supply chains, and made the U.S. appear institutionally divided and strategically reactive. 7. 3 possible outcomes emerged: prolonged economic freeze, dangerous escalation, or a quiet U.S. retreat. But one fact remains: the old rules of North American trade are broken. Life lessons you can apply. 1. Leverage only works if it's credible. Empty threats weaken your position, whether in business, negotiations, or personal relationships. 2. Diversification is protection. Don't depend on a single source of income, opportunity, or support. Build alternatives before you need them. 3. Short-term pain can prevent long-term control. Strategic sacrifice today may preserve independence tomorrow. 4. Emotional escalation often backfires. Calm, structured responses usually outperform loud reactions. 5. Systems matter more than moments. Institutions, rules, and preparation determine outcomes, not just bold declarations. 6. Respect builds durable alliances. Coercion may win compliance, but trust builds loyalty. This story is ultimately about resilience and strategic thinking. Nations, like individuals, face moments when pressure tests their independence. The lesson is not about choosing sides, it's about understanding power, preparing wisely, and acting with clarity instead of fear. In a world of rapid shifts, those who think long-term, build options, and stay disciplined will always have the advantage. If you value deep geopolitical analysis that connects global power struggles to real economic consequences, subscribe to Plit Audio on YouTube. Support independent analysis that goes beyond headlines and explains what these shifts mean for your wallet, your work, and your future. Stay informed, stay prepared. This content is for informational and analytical purposes only. It reflects geopolitical and economic interpretation based on publicly available information and hypothetical scenario framing. It does not constitute financial, legal, or investment advice. Viewers should conduct their own research and consult qualified professionals before making decisions based on global political or market developments.